Okay, I think in a complete reversal of normal Brussels timekeeping, we will start early. So welcome to this panel on pay or OK. I'm sure you all know why you're here, but to recap, we know that there's been quite a lot of opinions around this, largely in sort of initially at least in response to Meta's subscription option to allow users to pay for a fee to Facebook and Instagram. And then we saw on the 17th of April as well, the European Data Protection Board published its opinion saying, well, not really okay with pay or OK. They don't necessarily represent a real choice and are unlikely to meet the standard of GDPR requirements. So we're going to talk about that today. You can see who we are behind me. I'm Jennifer Baker. I will be the moderator. I'm a tech policy journalist and moderator. We're going to try and make this a little bit more interactive than maybe some of the old-fashioned CPDP panels that we know from days gone by over in the Alde Skarbik. We're going to break it into 3 topics. So we've got, experts here on each of those 3 topics, as well as sort of all-purpose lawyers who can weigh into any topic. We're going to look at legal assessment that we have so far by the CJEU, the EDPB, and in the text of the GDPR. We're going to look at the actual meaning of free decision or free choice and what that means for consent rates. We will then also look at the economic reality of consent, ads, and subscriptions and how that plays out, particularly in a journalistic context. Then we'll have Q&A, and we'll wrap up by hopefully getting a quick word from each of our speakers on the path forward. So our speakers are Tobias Uden from the Norwegian DPA, who has led the work on the EDPB's pay or OK opinion that I mentioned on behalf of the Norwegian DPA. He'll be talking us through that first topic. Taking the lead, or setting the scene, if you like, on the second topic, Sandra Andrzekiewicz is a researcher in the areas of behavioral economics and behavioral finance at ETH Zurich. So I'm really looking forward to hearing something that we don't necessarily always hear at CPDP. Marco Kaiser is from Die Zeit, is the CTO, and has introduced the pay or OK approach for their newspaper. Currently, I understand, charging about €62 a year to reject consent. He's going to break it all down for us with the figures. Etienne Drouard from Organised is advertising clients that use pay or OK in France in particular and has written studies on the matter. And Max Schrems from NOYB has brought a number of complaints, to say the least. So, our first topic, legal assessment that we have so far. Tobias, I've put this sort of onto you to set the scene for us. I know there are specific elements that you've highlighted as being really essential when coming to making judgments on this. So detriment, clear imbalance, conditionality, and granularity. Talk us through this. Tell us about these elements and how they make sense together.
Right, yeah. So many of you may be familiar with the Bundeskartellamt judgment that came last summer, I believe. And there was a very interesting passage in that judgment. Essentially, it said that in some cases you may offer, let's say you have a situation where you ask users to consent to processing activities that are not really necessary for your service. And users would then have to provide such a consent or otherwise be unable to use the service. That is what we refer to as conditionality. And the court said, well, this is not okay, but in such a case you could, if necessary, provide an equivalent alternative for an appropriate fee, so that users would still be able to use the service without consenting, but in that case they would need to pay a fee. And this is kind of what has been referred to, I would say, as the pay or OK model, right? And probably you know this, either you consent or you pay. Simple, you would say. And what we saw is essentially that there are different ways to interpret this. Some stakeholders would say that, okay, the court actually spelled out that this is a possibility, so therefore this is always permissible. And now, whenever you're faced with a choice to consent, we can charge users who don't consent. And then you have other people, such as the one sitting next to me, saying this is never okay because it is not freely given. And this is also something that the court touches upon in the Bundeskartellamt judgment. Consent needs to be freely given. So there seems to be some sort of tension between the two. And the question was, well, how can you navigate this landscape? To which of these, let's say, elements do you provide or give priority? And in the wake here, in vacuum of uncertainty, what we saw as regulators is that more and more companies were actually then deploying pay or okay or consent or pay models. And this was a bit concerning to us, also because it was not really clear how to interpret this in a holistic way, in a harmonized way across Europe. That is the background why ourselves, together with Dutch colleagues and colleagues from the Hamburg regulators, asked the EDPB for this opinion. And essentially, EDPB goes through, let's say, what is really a freely given consent. Building upon previous guidance, but also building upon the Bundeskartellamt judgment itself. Because actually what the Court of Justice says is that when looking at whether consent was validly given, and in particular freely given, you need to assess were users faced with detriments if they chose to withhold or withdraw their consent. If that is the case, consent would not be freely given. Would there be a clear imbalance? Would the position of the organization, the company, be such as to influence users' choice? If that is the case, then no, consent is probably not okay. It's probably not freely given. Again, you have the passage on conditionality, which I referenced, and then also users should be in a position to provide grounded choices, meaning that they should be able to consent separately to different processing activities. And let's say the controversial statement here from the court that in some cases where users don't consent, well, they can pay a fee instead. This was pertaining to conditionality in particular. So what the EDPB says is that, okay, this type of model could, where appropriate, be a way to mitigate a situation of conditionality. If you don't consent, you're blocked from the service. Oh no, you can also pay a fee. Okay, so that solves the issue of conditionality. Then the EDPB says, what about the three other elements? Mm-hmm. Please don't forget about the three other elements, because the law is also clear, there shall not be detriment, and consent is not appropriate where there is a clear imbalance. So then the EDPB started to look a bit at, okay, so how does that look, for example, specifically in the context of large online platforms? The reason why the EDPB chose, or why we requested an opinion on this particular matter is because, well, then you have processing that's affecting a lot of people across Europe. In all the member states of the EU and the EEA, you have these platforms, you have large-scale processing, it's affecting a lot of people, meaning also that the risk is quite high. And there are also some, I would say, specificities about these services, and these specificities, they kind of influence user choice. So if you look at, for example, detriment, okay, a platform asks you to consent to something which is not objectively necessary for the service. If you don't want to consent to that, you can either pay or leave the service. So it seems like you have three choices there, which is great, right? Well, actually, the reality is, we all know, not everyone is in a position to really pay a fee. Not everyone has the financial means to pay, for example. And so if you simply don't have the money to pay, you're faced with two choices. You consent or you leave the platform. And you can argue, well, you still have a choice there. So what the EDPB does is look at, okay, but what is the situation from the perspective of users, from the data subjects? Let's say, for example, that we're talking about some sort of social media, for example, where you have strong network effects. It's not like you could easily just switch over to a different social platform if all your friends and family remain on the original platform. Let's say you're keeping in touch with all your friends and family on TikTok, as an example. Okay, so you might argue, oh, you could just switch to Pinterest instead. It's probably not going to cover your needs, you know. So this is one situation where users might say, okay, I don't want to consent, but actually leaving is not an option, because then I can't keep in touch with my American cousin or my friends that I met backpacking, or someone living in a different part of the country. So this is how network effects can actually lead to detriment. And since then, suddenly leaving the platform is no longer a realistic option for you. Okay, suddenly you only have one choice, and that is to accept, because you're not in a position to pay and you can't really leave the platform. A different example would be something that we see a lot, at least in Norway, where one particular platform is rather big and commonly used. So a lot of important information is shared on that platform only. So for example, if you're a parent in Norway, you might find that information pertaining to your children's sports activities, or let's say a parent group from the school, they will use one particular platform. And you might say, okay, I'm not accepting this. I want to leave the platform, but actually then I will lose out of all of that information. It will affect my daily life. It would affect my children adversely. Oh, I can't leave. Oh, I guess I'll just have to accept. So this is another example. And then you also have lock-in effects. So let's say you're a content creator, and you have spent a lot of time, you're really invested in a given platform, you have gained followers, you have likes, and then suddenly again, leaving may not be an option for you. And if you can't pay the fee, then you will just have to accept. And the EDPB says, well, this does not look like a free choice. Most likely it is not. So therefore, that would not be okay. And the same goes for, we talked a bit now about detriment. The same goes also for clear imbalance, because some of the platform may have a very dominant position. And interestingly here, a lot of the platforms, they started off as being free, right? So you use them thinking, oh, these will be free services, I can use them for free forever. Everyone invests a lot in them. And maybe some of these platforms have some sort of addictive elements as well, so you get addicted to them. And then suddenly one day they go, oh, now we're going to charge you unless you accept to give away, your data for these purposes which maybe you don't like. So this is also an example of how you can kind of see this clear imbalance in practice. And if there's a clear imbalance, then normally consent would not be appropriate. It would not be freely given. So this is kind of the core, I would say, of the EDPB opinion, that yes, there could still be cases where the EDPB does not say that pay or pay is never acceptable, but it really says you need to look at the specificities, you need to really analyze all the elements, and if there's something there that doesn't entail free choice, then you have an issue. And actually, the burden of proof is on the companies. So if the companies want to use this kind of business model, they need to prove to us that actually users really have a freely given choice. If they're not in a position to do that, they cannot use this business model. And the recommendation from the EDPB is to avoid this kind of very binary thinking that either you consent to very intrusive behavioral advertising or you pay to see no advertising. So there are many issues with that kind of thinking. The EDPB recommends, well, you could still have a free of charge version which is based on a less intrusive form of advertising. And that could be a form of advertising that could be based on legitimate interest, for example. So it kind of avoid this pesky consent, which I know that many industry stakeholders find a bit difficult, or rather it's our interpretation of it that they find difficult. But just to show that there are actually many opportunities here.
Yep.
And in a nutshell, I think that's it.
Quite a large nutshell, but so, I mean, obviously we're not just one and done with this CJEU decision or indeed with the opinion. Toby, I'll ask you just very briefly what will be the next steps in terms of larger guidelines and what can we expect before I come on to Max and Marco.
Yeah. So the work is ongoing at the EDPB. So right now we're starting to work on guidelines that are a bit more general. So the scope of the opinion I referenced is limited in the sense that it looks at the very large platforms, or simply large platforms, and looks at behavioral advertising specifically. So the EDPB is going to do guidelines that look at all kinds of services and processing for different kind of purposes. And in that regard, we're also talking a lot about stakeholder involvement. So we're looking at how we can do that effectively. We're thinking maybe we should do a stakeholder event after the summer, just to ensure that all voices are heard before we really start working on this, so that everyone can feel reassured that the EDPB is taking into account all the different perspectives here.
Etienne, let me ask you, as you're giving advice to clients, I mean, what do you want to see coming from those sorts of guidelines following these opinions and rulings?
I'm expecting clarification of who sells the law. Is it the EUCG or the EDPB? And is it privacy regulators or consumer protection regulators or competition regulators or DSA regulators? And this is where we not only need further guidelines, but also an expression from further and other regulators. Because here we have consumer protection issues, competition issues, data protection issues, taking into account the effect of a choice on your freedom to consent. And it is a long-term history for consumer protection guidance. It's a long-term analysis and interpretation under competition law about the substitution of a service from one point to another, either regarded by the service provider or by the consumer itself. And so far, there is a case-by-case analysis requirement, which means that any general opinion will be insufficient to establish whether a specific situation of a service for a specific price could be considered valid. So there is no ban, there is no overall authorization of these services, and we have criteria to conduct interpretations. One of these criteria, two of these criteria you mentioned, are equivalent service for an appropriate price. And this doesn't come from the EDPB, this comes from the European Court of Justice, which therefore has set up the bar to consider that if the service is equivalent and the price is appropriate, these options take into account your freedom of consent, depending on the price, depending on the equivalency of the service, but the question of the detriment will therefore lead to consider, is the price appropriate and is the service equivalent? But there is no preliminary question on, is 1 cent a detrimental price for my freedom of consent? This question has been excluded by the UCJ. And it has been done so because there was a kind of journey across legal bases. Was it necessary for the performance of an agreement? Was it legitimate compared with the fundamental rights of users? And finally, since it is based on cookies governed by consent requirement, is this consent still free when you have to choose between a price or a consent? And the answer is yes, it is free because of a first criterion. Are you informed of the nature and specificities of this choice? Making a choice doesn't mean you are absolutely in a discretionary choice. Making a choice is to be informed that if you don't want to pay, if you don't want advertising, you don't have any right to have access to a service, unless it is paid by tax or by yourself. And if you have the right to consent, if you don't consent, who will pay for you for the provision of a service? So people that have the luxury to consent or not consent will raise the question of who pays for them. I have a whole book in my office, coming from my grandmother, dated 1838. It's a law journal listing some legal decision from courts. And every 2 pages you have an advertisement for a rifle, for a medicine, for a specific beverage. At this moment in history, there was no money to publish these legal decisions without advertisement. And this is still true. For the past 25 years, I've been advising sports, media, newspapers on the way you could fund their service, and I'm sure that nobody in this room ignores that these services have been funded by advertising. And this is where consent is a matter of context, balance, the amount of a price, and your dependency or detriment not to have access to a service, but these services are not public services. They are not paid by tax.
Well, let me move on, Marco, to you to move the conversation forward a little bit, because the specificities of journalism and reporting websites are slightly different from, for example, social media or different other platforms. Firstly, I mean, how did your regulator deal with this question? And I understand there's a complaint filed against Seaside by NOYB. Tell us a little bit about that. We will save the economic discussion and advertising discussion until the last part, but give us your first reaction to this.
Yeah, thank you. just for the record, that complaint is done by now, so it's closed.
Okay.
Thanks, Max.
And thanks for coming on the panel.
Sure.
That's good conversations.
No. Yeah, I mean, I found it very interesting what Tobias just said, because all the examples you mentioned, I could not really apply to us. So for the background, we started one of the first pay or consent models basically in Germany, I think almost in Europe, in 2020, early 2020. There was already in Austria, which also Max had some fun with, I think, before, from Der Standard, such a model. But then in Germany, Der Spiegel, another media house, and us started that early 2020. And basically, we started because of a recommendation of our local DPA. They said there's suitable models now that you can look at Der Standard and Spiegel, and we would recommend that you implement these. And we did. And even before, when it became clear that at some point we would need consent for advertising on the site, which has always been one of the pillars of revenue for media in Germany, but just one, for example, we always said we cannot implement a consent model where users can just deny consent and still use the product in the same way as everybody else who pays or gives consent, because quality journalism is not cheap. It has cost for us to produce. We want to be independent. We don't want to be subsidized by the government, by the state. We don't want to be financed by somebody who has some personal interest into running media and maybe shaping the public opinion. Right, that's independent quality journalism. And so the pay or okay model for us seemed to be really the best choice that we had. And we are not lawmakers, we are not authorities, we are not policymakers. We try to kind of work within the framework, the legal framework that we see, that we have, and in that model, and from all the discussions that we had, and we just recently, because of the NOYB case or complaint against us, which led to discussions between us and our, Germany 18 DPAs, but anyway, it was the Hamburg DPA, and we had month-long discussions with them, and we found a model now that they approve, and they say, this is fine, this is a free consent, you can use that, it is pay or okay, you can, in the okay way, still do some adjustments of your consent, so you can revoke consent for, recommendations for content, which is not advertising-based, you can opt out of social media embeds and stuff like that, but everything that we need to finance that product, everything that we need to monetize it, yes, that is required to consent to if you don't pay us some money. And yeah, so basically that's where we are, and we still think it's a very, very simple model. Everybody understands it. When we introduced it, we got a couple dozen, I wouldn't even say complaints, more like questions from users. Some just didn't understand, but we always had advertising with tracking before, and we're furious that we are now starting to track them. Some said, okay, I already have another subscription, why do I have to pay again? Yeah, okay. Since then, we don't get any complaints, right? I mean, users understand the model, they don't complain about it. There's, except from that one complaint at the DPA, I don't know of any other against the model on our side. So I think the model is accepted, the model is clear, and we are fine using it. And I really want to say, what's the alternative? Because, and that's with the recent EDPB opinion formulated, it really makes me ask myself, okay, are we a target of that opinion? Because it's so unspecific in whom it really addresses with large online platforms. There's no clear definition, again, obviously. I mean, this has been a roller coaster ride as a business for 6 years now, where we always, in this principle-based legislation, right, okay, how does it apply to us, right? It's always very heavy based on interpretation. But it's very unspecific in the terms of who does it apply to, but then it kind of suggests that one alternative way that everybody has to implement, because advertising without targeting, I mean, I don't like it that it is like that, but it is like that is not viable as a monetization source for us, right? It just does not earn enough money to run the product as a whole. It just doesn't work. And if we go down that way, last sentence,
yep.
If we go down that way, basically, and look at US or wherever, we will be a pay-only site, right? I mean, that's the consequence if we are really forced to go down that way.
Right. Well, you added in the caveat, doesn't work for us, because it does work in other places, and I'm sure we'll get into a discussion about that.
For quality media journalism in Germany. That's the
Okay.
context I'm talking about.
Yes. And we'll segue into Sandra, because you said users don't complain. We'll talk in a second about maybe why they don't. Max, I'll give you a quick word on where we still need a little bit of additional clarification, particularly on necessary and appropriate, before we move into this behavioural.
Yeah, I'll try.
segment.
I took a couple of notes. I think most of it was covered already. First of all, what I found interesting, there's also this cookie pledge that, I mean, was born to die. But there was the interesting discussion about this third option, about like, also having some other option, which now comes back up in the EDPB paper. And on the example with your mom reading papers with the rifle, that was not personalized advertisement, and they could still basically publish that stuff. So we're going to get into that in the third piece of the discussion, but maybe, there are these other examples that, it may not be that binary, so I wanted to put that forward. The other thing that I think is important maybe to zoom out a bit is, even if you read the Bundeskartellamt decision, and I think it's right up there, we're basically talking about 6 words. Don't read the rest. I just want to throw it up there. And this is even in the judgment, one paragraph of a load of other, it has to be genuine and free choice. It's embedded in the current kind of case law that we know from before. So I'm a bit skeptical if we can say, okay, there's now these couple of words, so everything is done, we're done with the discussion. I personally think all of this goes back to the Court of Justice in a case where this is really dealt with. Because the Bundeskartellamt case was also, for people that may not have been that involved, I think there were 10, 15 questions posed to the Court of Justice, and so much more than ever else. And as far as I know, pay-or-okay was not deeply discussed at the Court of Justice. So a bit of a background, we had a hearing in January at the Court of Justice where the judges were very interested in pay-or-okay with Meta and wanted to hear much more about that. So I think it may not be as set in stone as some people may perceive it right now. So I think that is important for the general context. And when we really go into what is this genuine and free choice and the appropriate fee, it's a bit like, 6 words, so it's like trying to figure out what the Oracle of Delphi is trying to tell us, I think, sometimes, because all the context is missing on where that came from, what the arguments were, where these words really come from. And there is discussions, is that a subjective appropriate fee, which was mentioned before, if you simply don't have the money? Is it objective of the whole society? Can the average person afford that, for example? Is it just the appropriateness of the fee, so how high the number is, or is the fee appropriate towards not interfering with the freedom of choice? And all of that, everybody in the room has a different view of what these words mean. So I just want to, at the end maybe also of the first part, caution to think that there may be a lot of dimensions how to see this really. And I wouldn't want to be in your shoes to make sense of it all. But that is part maybe of this discussion that we will see a second round more or less where this will get clarified. I hope that's useful as an add-on.
Sandra, you've been listening to us throwing the phrase free consent around, probably thinking, my gosh, I researched this, it's not that straightforward. Tell us, what your interpretation, when through your research on free consent and free decision means, and whether there are patterns that are emerging in other areas other than necessarily pay or okay that might be useful for us to apply to the pay or okay model.
Right, as you already pointed out, it's actually in 2 fields that deal with decision making, basically behavior economics and judgment decision making. It's not really well defined what free choice is. And the reason for that is that we usually research decision making from the perspective of a certain number of choice options. Now, we have something that is called like the free choice paradigm, which would assume that we present a person or user or decision maker with an exhaustive list of potential choice options that you have for a given problem, and then we rank how much they prefer each of these, and we let them choose between these. So one could say, okay, so freedom of choice in that case would be we just generate an exhaustive list of choice options, and we kind of solve the problem of freedom of choice. But it's much more complex than this. So, for example, in this free choice paradigm, what has been found is that if we let people rank their preferences and they just have two options that they like equally well, and then we ask them to choose between these two, and they make their choice. And then when we ask them again to rank them, they start to prefer the choice options that they already chose more. So it comes something like a first paradox of typical economic behavior and a choice preference. And we have actually much more than that, which is a choice architecture. So for those of you who don't know what that is, choice architecture is basically like designing the set of choice options so that you can nudge the user or the customer or a person to make certain choice for, let's say, option A instead of for option B or the other way around. And you can do this in different ways. So you can basically manipulate the number of choice options you give people, or you can bundle them, or you can change the saliency of different attributes of those choice options. So for example, you can present people with a choice option that is completely irrelevant for the choice context, but it shifts the attention to, for example, a price or functionality or something else. So that's another very, very important aspect in designing those free choices. And nudging. Maybe you've heard about a book called Nudge. It's basically when we create those choice options that we push people to make certain decisions. Maybe you also heard about topics like in which countries people are more likely to donate their organs. When you have to opt in or opt out, it makes a big difference. So if you have to opt in, you have actually more cost, more mental cost, more cognitive cost to make that transition than when you have to opt out. That's another typical bias. Now, when we have a lot of those choice options that we can choose from, we are obviously facing something like cognitive load. So it's demanding. Decision making is always demanding because we have to process all of that information, especially like when it's in the context of a legal topic, when we have to read or what these are, we have to process them. And when we have to deal with this cognitively demanding situation, we actually use heuristics very often. And this is where sometimes platforms can actually use our, let's say, limited cognitive capacity that we always assume, well, let's click on the button that is the most salient. So you frame the whole choice problem such that it's more salient. Well, we could just remove that, and there are also studies showing that that you can change or make a preference reversal, so-called. But again, I think it doesn't really solve the problem completely because we still have the problem of like too much choice effect and limited cognitive capacity. So these are like kind of the counter arguments of just simply, allowing the complete freedom of choice in terms of an exhaustive number of choice options. Now, when we look at maybe less behavior literature about what is the freedom of choice, we actually see synonyms such as autonomy, independence, and self-determinations, which are very strongly related to our culture aspects. So freedom of choice would be something like getting exactly what you want to get from your choice. Now, but can you really get exactly what you want? Like when we just had a discussion, it was a beautiful discussion from 2 points, when we have media providers and we have social media providers, where media providers are probably more like products where I opt in. So basically I uptake, so it's an uptake decision. Whereas in many social media, we are already embedded because we've been users for a long time, and now suddenly we have to take a decision whether we want to quit. And here we have psychological effects such as regret, so we might regret. We have withdrawal. We, again, maybe you invested a lot of time and a lot of effort in generating content. So there will be a significant effect of loss. And in behavior economics, any kind of loss hurts us more than the gain. So we have the difference in decision making when we uptake a product or a service and when we have to give it up. So I would say the behavioral science definitely needs still much more research in terms of what exactly the freedom of choice means. But what we definitely know at the current stage is that just by manipulating the choice architecture, you can very strongly manipulate the uptake and the decision of whether I want to consent or not. We can also manipulate the framing. Framing is basically how you package the particular choice problem and how you explain it so that it gives you one meaning or the other. An example would be whether you consent to receive targeted advertising or whether you consent for targeted advertising and other purposes, where maybe you don't know what the other purposes would be. Or maybe the provider actually tells you how they would be using the data that they obtain from you. And here comes yet another interesting aspect, mainly transparency. So we also know from technology adoption literature where that users are generally much more likely to uptake new technology or a service related to the digital technology, and the moment when it's more transparent because they can build trust with the provider. And that would be yet another important aspect that would basically allow for the freedom of choice, at least in my interpretation. So apart from having an exhaustive choice option, so that they're also clear about what these choice options are so that they are not ambiguous or not uncertain.
And is there something about the behavior of all of us online that is different from the offline? I mean, for example, I don't know why I always order the third cheapest bottle on a wine list or something like that. And how do you measure that? I mean, is there a disconnect in what people say they're going to do and what they do?
Right, there's actually a clear distinction between that. So we call it planned choices and actual choices tend to be quite different. So what we attempt to do and what we actually do does not always overlap. Is that a question about how we research this type of? Okay, so the way to research that. So I think we definitely should do much more research in the domain of consenting with using our data. But we have a lot of research in the domain of marketing and risky decision making, where we simply ask people to choose between two different or more different choice options. And we structure those different choice options so we know what is kind of the mechanism behind that, and we know what we are manipulating. Is it about the framing? Is it about the amount of information? Is it about the number of choice options? And then we just measure the percentage of the chosen options by the users or by participants of our experiments.
Toby, I mean, you're going to have to try and put this within a legal analysis. It's challenging. Tell us how you're approaching it.
Good question. But what I really like about this is we're talking about free choice here. I don't want to put the media representative in a tough spot, but...
Yes, do it.
Feel free. I'm used to that.
I won't.
I know, but I feel that you're talking about the fact that you have a very legitimate interest in providing quality journalism to the public, and this is part of our democracies. It is key. But here we're talking about legitimate interests, whereas the processing at stake is so intrusive that it cannot be based on legitimate interest as a legal basis in many cases. So if we look more towards the legal analysis, I would argue that we need to talk less about the interest and how they balance out, because if it's intrusive behavioral advertising, the balancing interest goes to the favor of the individual, the data subject. So then I think what we as regulators need to focus more on is what is in the law. Is this freely given? You're happy with this, okay. That's good.
Stick to the law, yes.
Yes, no, but exactly. So we have a lot of these very compelling arguments, but I think what we need to do is actually learn more from behavioral economics, for example, and really understand how do users make these choices. And you have stuff such as the privacy paradox, where people want privacy, but they're not willing to pay for it, and arguably it's a fundamental right, so you shouldn't have to pay for it, and you shouldn't have to trade away your rights in order to get services. So I think that indeed the key is for regulators, but also organizations to really look into what affects users' choice and when can users really be said to have a free choice and not.
Marco, I'm going to let you respond, but Max, I think you have a slide first you want to show us.
To make sure, we already talked about before, and people know the slides that are there. What we especially, I mean, we are not experts in decision making. We know from especially dark patterns as well. There is numbers by the big consent management platforms, by moving the button, by coloring that way, you get this and that percentage of people suddenly changing their mind. So there's in that quite good numbers. We had a pre-talk. We basically got the numbers from Der Standard, which is the first ones that did in Austria. Consent Pass was also public. That's one of our main lines of argument to say, okay, we know 3 to 10%, depending on the study, actually want to have personalized advertisement and targeting and tracking and all that kind of stuff. Depends on how the question is framed, what percentage you get. But then with Der Standard, we know from litigation that the consent rate is 99.9%. So we usually said it's a bit of a North Korean result, so how can that be free choice? Same thing with Content Pass, which is basically a platform of more than 300 websites. A lot of them are tiny and you've never heard of them, where you can pay once and then basically you can log into all the different sites. That's a German software that does that. They also said they have the 99.9%. There's an overview by the IBB that more or less goes around that. I think there's one website that reported 94%, but they have a huge subscription base already, so that may not be representative. At the same time, we had a pre-talk, and I'll throw that in right away. And Mark already said since they did pay okay, also the bounce rate went up a lot, and that is not in the 99.9% because a lot of people, when they see the pay okay banner, just don't go further, which is this third option of leaving, so to say. So that would also be interesting in, what are the free choices and how in practice, in numbers, does that play out? Because basically what you mentioned is a lot of the factors that go in, and we kind of know the end result number, more or less. We don't know the factors that really and how big they are, but I just wanted to throw that in on the freely given part. And
thank you.
Yeah, Marco, your experience with this.
Yeah, no, I mean, and first of all, I mean, we are privately owned media houses, right? We are not like, our owners are often driven by wanting to do like quality journalism, but in the end they want to earn money, right? So it's not really about like legitimate interest, and we are a service to democracy. Yes, we are, but we are not the only ones. There's, in Germany at least, there's a publicly funded media, öffentlich-rechtlicher Rundfunk, great German name. And everybody has access to that. You don't need to give your consent there. You get information. You are part of the information society. You get all the news there, right? So we don't lock anybody out of that. We are not. That's in terms of detriment and like power imbalance, basically. So nobody is locked out of news, of taking part in media, basically, because they can't access our site. And yes, that's. Now you took it away again, but
There it is.
right back there.
since I've been advocating for the model for a couple of years now within media houses, and they ask always, because they ask us, right, like, okay, how does it work for you? How can you implement that? What are the numbers? What's the conversion rate, basically? What's the consent rate? And yes, from some people you always hear these numbers on the left, and it's a great model, it gives you 99% or whatever. In fact, it's not true, because like you have a lot of people who actually use that third way in their choice architecture, I would say, or in the choices they have, is neither picking pay or okay, but just go away. And that's 30% of users who are facing this layer, basically, where they are asked this question. Which to me, and again, I'm not a scientist, and we talked about this before as well a bit, but people understand that they can go away. They are not actually forced or pushed to either use one or the other option, right? A third, basically, roughly, goes away and picks the third way and finds their news probably somewhere else. And that's okay, right, for us. We don't, we have to accept it, and we do accept it, but in total, it still makes the model work for us. But having this consent layer basically leads to 30% of users who come to the site and have not given consent before, obviously, to go away again.
Well, you're perfectly segueing into section 3, because you're a pro and it's about time. So tell us a bit more. Do break down some of those figures for us. Make the justification argument that we're all here to hear.
Yeah, I'm not sure which numbers. In addition, I need to actually.
How much of the revenue, advertising revenue, is essential? And what are the other streams? How do they, fit together? you know,
Yeah,
in terms of viability?
I mean, let me first say, like, I think the whole price discussion, at least when it comes to what the actual price should be or how high it should be, is not part of data protection law and should not be. And I think you said before as well, it's maybe consumer protection law, it's maybe some market surveillance stuff, but it should not be data protection law. And again, I know some data protection authorities who also say that, right? Price is not our point, it's not our business, unless you make it, and we're going back to the CGU thing, like appropriate, I think was the wording there. So I would always say like affordable to the average user. So non-prohibitive was another way of saying it. And I can totally agree to that. But if it should be like €1, €2, €5, or €10, I think that has to be a decision by the business itself, because it depends on their monetization model that they have. For us, I can say, and it's always, you haven't brought up that chart yet about the revenue per user per ad. I was expecting that, Max. You can always look at it like that and say, okay, well, that doesn't make any sense that you charge like €5 a month or whatever, which is kind of like the average price.
If I may explain for a second what's up there, that's according to the IB, how much they make per user per month on all websites in all of Europe. So if you're a user in Austria, for example, it's 60 cents or whatever that all websites make in programmatic advertisement. I'll also just to get through with that, there's a second number which is display ads, which is much broader. That's also what's on your cell phone, what's on TikTok, like everything, not just programmatic. And there the average is €5.59. So one of our arguments is usually if all of advertisement that is digital is €5.59 per user per month, how can one newspaper, like in Austria, I know you're cheaper, but the Austrian one that we worked on, charge €9? Like that one newspaper asks for more money than all of the others make together. So in the appropriate fee discussion, how much is that a factor? So I'll shut up there.
Yeah. No worries. I asked for the chart, so. No, and my point is just like, I can tell you a little bit about how we came to that price, but that's just for us, right? And that probably applies to a couple other media houses as well. I cannot talk for Meta. I cannot talk for any other site that does e-commerce or whatever, because the model gets adopted by many more sectors on the internet over time. For us, basically, and you may agree or disagree to that, but we looked at our revenue before we introduced consent, which was partly advertising money, partly subscription money. And then we had to introduce consent. Fair enough. That's the law. And the cost stays the same, right? I mean, we have the same 500 editors who are writing content. We have the same technical infrastructure to run it. We have the same people doing everything else. And now we're losing probably 10, 20, 30% of users, or at least of revenue from users through advertising. And that money just goes away. So whatever we come up with as a next business model has to kind of compensate that. Which means that if we have a way to generate money here from users who do not want to consent, which is, again, their fair choice, we still have to have, at least at the end, the same money if we want to remain the same kind of like cost and profit structure. And that's where you come to a price. And that price comes, or is higher than what you have here, and I won't break it down for you like to the very detail, but ad revenue is just one part of it. Another part of it is, if we don't have consent from users, we also cannot give them personalized advertisement for our own subscriptions for content, right? Because like they didn't give us consent for that. And that is a significant source of revenue for us. And not having the chance to make users like targeted offers just decreases conversion into a subscription for us. Also, offering a subscription has cost. Technical cost, we have to have people who deal with it, we have to send invoices, whatever. All that plays into that. So lost advertising money is just one part of what we have to compensate through a subscription for a pay or consent model.
If I may jump in super quickly, because we outside on this table had a wonderful conversation yesterday, and you explained also the advertisement part as a class system on an airplane, which for me was super interesting, maybe for a lot of the people in the crowd.
Sure.
Sorry to...
You go for it.
No, I mean, I mean, I think we started yesterday from the point like, okay, then just go out and sell it yourself, and then you have a much higher margin because like everything in programmatic is low cost or low revenue and high cost maybe for the technical infrastructure, which it is. We still earn more than half of the money that the advertiser spends goes to us, right? I mean, you asked that question as well, which I think is also in an economy where there's a lot of layers in between who also like have cost and want to earn money is fair. But yes, advertising that we sell directly to clients that are on basically the homepage, right? And so there's a guarantee that a couple 100,000 people will actually really see it. That has the highest revenue for us. But we cannot sell all the inventory for ads that we have on the site through this because there's not enough people who actually will spend that much money for advertising. And that means that we cannot basically have our ad revenue just from that part of like selling. We do that. We do all three things. And I compared it to a class system on a plane, right? I mean, if you're an airline and you have a first, business, and economy class, you have three classes, right? You would probably most profitable if you only had first class, but you will never sell out that plane because there are not enough people actually buying first class tickets. So you have to have a mixture, right? And IO, which we call it, is an initial offer. So that's actually inventory offered to clients for advertising. That has the highest revenue. Then we have some that is bought from us and some other partner sites, which we are marketed together with. That is kind of like the business class, if you want. And then we have programmatic advertising, open marketplaces, where nobody really sees or decides that they want to advertise on our site. They are just targeting audiences, right? And we seem to have them, so the ads happen on our site. That's the lowest income, but it fills basically the inventory. And the mix of all of that makes it possible to have revenue. But still, that means because we have these high revenue parts in that mix, we earn quite a bit of money and maybe more than that on the average user. And you also have websites that only work on that economy part, right? That only have programmatic. But that also means they earn much less money than we from advertising. And if they don't have a subscription business besides, they don't earn much money at all, which also means they probably don't have much money to do quality content. So free content or content that does not have significant advertising revenue will not have a good monetization and will be not so good, maybe.
I'll add one sentence. Yesterday you said it's the Ryanair of advertisement. That
yeah.
explained it quite well to me, at least.
You get what you pay for, I would say.
Well, I'm going to abuse my position as moderator to make a couple of comments as a journalist that are not necessarily questions, but in terms of this first-class advertisement, I mean, from an editorial independence point of view, it makes sense that you don't want to be solely dependent on 2 or 3 advertisers who then become de facto content gatekeepers. But at the same time, you did mention it's business about profits, and speaking as a journalist, not all those profits go back to creating, journalism. Journalists are very badly paid, actually, and use a lot of shareholders there who do not want to see their revenues drop, despite the massive shift to digital. They got used and got drunk on the big profits, and they're not prepared to take that cut when we started giving away our editorial for free. So there's a few different elements at play here, and it possibly stems back to the actual inception of the internet, where, unlike any other business model, newspapers said, oh, I know, we'll just give away our stuff for free, because who would do that? The gaming industry didn't do that, and they've been smart. Etienne, I'm going to let you jump back in. That's my 2 cents, and I'm taking my hat off now.
But can I just say one thing? I mean, I totally understand what you say about, not the money going back to the journalists. I agree, but also don't... it's not always the same and everywhere the same thing, right? So, yeah.
So you're...
Right?
No.
Hello? Yes, you're perfectly right. Because people are not ready to pay more. So if we look at those numbers, first, personalized advertising versus display or contextual advertising as a 3 times difference of a price. So if we would like to replace personalized advertising with display or contextual advertising, we would need 3 times more advertising spaces and not editorial content, which would increase the level of algorithms to prioritize advertising and therefore would focus more on your centers of interest. So at the end of the day, who is able to target an audience better Is it because of personal advertising or display advertising? In press and media, when you deal with Gaza, what is the editorial advertisement you will insert in your articles? Not sure it will be a coffee machine or a car. But when you deal with social media, the lemon tart recipe or the new fashion that you are seeing in your flow could be editorial advertising, contextual advertising, and it would focus more on your centers of interest than some forms of personalized advertising. And what I want to say is that some big players could be efficient in display advertising, which would be, in fact, targeting people more. So the division between it is personalized or it is displayed or contextual is not exactly the right balance. And when you use display advertising or contextual advertising, you still need to measure it, because no advertiser will ever pay anything if he cannot measure the efficiency. So you will still and always have a cookie. So the question is not personalized. It's cookieless or with cookies. It's with tracking identifiers or without. And there is no advertiser ready to pay for no measurement of anything. So cookies are the reason why they pay for any kind of advertising, personalized or contextual advertising. And in France, we did some statistics, collective statistics, because nobody wanted to provide these numbers. Pure online media depend at 96% on advertising revenues. And when they are hybrid between paper and online, it may be 70 to 60 to 50% of their revenues. But at the end of the day, the freedom of choice is also to be addressed. Who fixes the price? Who fixes the price? People that can afford accessing a service, or companies that can afford providing a service. And this is where I think that privacy advocates are absolutely useful and necessary to raise issues, but useless to provide solutions. Here, we have question of a fair price for an equivalent service, and as you properly described it, what is the rate of people making a choice? A choice is always losing half of the proposition. And people are not ready to pay for a service, but they are not ready also they don't know exactly how they will ask for their privacy. We have 3 texts within the European Union considering that you could either pay with some money or with your personal data. The Omnibus Directive on Consumer Protection, the Content and Media Directive that says people could either pay with their data or with a fee. So when we have 99% of people providing their consent, it reminds me a young Austrian student named Max Schrems claiming that he had a right of access. And starting from a right of access question, we led to a national security debate between the EU and the US. What is the proportion of people exercising their right of access? 0.03%. Does it mean that the right of access is invalid or violated because not many people use it? No. Why wouldn't it be the same for consent? If we have 99.9% of people providing that consent, it doesn't mean that this is useless, that this right is not available. So since we understand that we may not make the same choices, but we are offered the same alternatives, 99% is quite a good rate when 30% of people get rid of the service. The others don't care about making a choice at 72%, and the rest of people make a choice because it has to be an informed choice. It doesn't need to be a choice of accessing a service for free.
Before, Max, you jump in, Sandra. Sandra, people who don't make a choice, is it because they don't care about making a choice or because they're paralyzed in other ways?
We actually don't know it, why they don't make a choice. It could be that they don't care. It could be that they are not informed, or that they actually have no preference, right? So it's actually easier not to make a decision in many cases. May I add also to the topic that has been discussed so far? So we've been discussing a lot about advertising and using the consent for advertising purposes. But there is also the second layer, which is like how else is the cookie data used? Because actually what we generate, our data, sharing that the data that we generate with the private online use, just browsing, social media and so on, can be very dangerous. So sharing that can be dangerous in it, and it brings substantial risks. And already, today in the morning, I already found a study that the study was from 2013 that demonstrated the majority of users that download some kind of apps were willing to pay a minimal fee for the app so that the app is requesting fewer permissions from the phone, like for example location and so on. So there is already people's willingness to pay for not sharing their data, and they see the value in that data. Now, what I see as a general problem is that use of that data is somehow mixed up in this advertising thing, and it's kind of mixing up also the let's say the risks, because if I see an ad or I don't see an ad, it's not particularly risky, but other uses of my data might be quite risky. And also coming back to the topic, who defines the value of that data? I mean, actually, we have means of measuring that in science. It's called willingness to pay, which we basically give people a scale or certain options so that are at certain intervals of price. And this is how we evaluate how much people believe that something is worth. And this would be a nice add-on to this kind of research on who determines the value of the data and the value of an ad. Does it come from the business or does it come from the users? Another thing that we should also keep in mind, we don't really think about it too often, but there are so many small things that cause us consent or not. So for example, the consent rate of sharing privacy data on mobile devices is higher than on desktop computers or laptops. Why? We don't exactly know why, but because we're usually on the go with our mobiles, it feels a bit more gamified. We just go through. This is one of the effects that has been repeated in different type of studies, not only in terms of privacy, like consenting. And also a lot of these user experience elements, most of the time they get confounded. So when Max was talking about the statistics, like one study shows this percentage, another study shows something else. They are confounded by different aspects, so we just can definitely say that there are ways of increasing the consent, but it's not going to be clear-cut that one study shows 20% and another one shows 30%, because it's a lot of different small psychologicals that are at play at the same time. And this is something that you as a community in privacy should also be aware of, that this is not one single clear-cut answer to all of these topics.
Max.
I'll do a quick rebuttal, and I try to be super short on that. First of all, I think we now only talked about the business side of costs, so to say. We also looked for the countries that do have more pay or okay prevalent, how much that would be for a user per year just to visit the top 100 websites. We also, so it's in Germany about 1,500 euros just to visit the top 100 websites, which is the usual newspapers you visit, the weather websites and so on. And it's just starting, we're just starting off this trend. So also going back to the question of what people value it, maybe people value it high, I value, I don't know, a penthouse apartment very high, but I can't afford it anyway. So even on that side, I may just be factually cut out. We did another round basically thinking about what Meta is using for these apps. The average person has 36 apps on their phone. If all of them charge like Meta, we're talking about a 4-head family to be 36,000 euros a year just to opt out. Just if you run it and everybody does it at some point, that is higher than the average income in Europe. So that's, obviously there is a question of who is going to do it, and there's a difference between quality journalism, but there is no legal stop to do that. So that's a bit just to also think in the discussion on the other side of it, just quickly. And last but not least, but you can probably answer that right away, what I found interesting on the price point that the site basically put forward, basically said the price point has to be that way that in simple terms we end up with the same amount. So you could also reframe it in a very like controversial way, but probably you can answer that. It basically translates to the GDPR may not harm our business model. We put the price point at that point that we end up with the same result. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, if
Okay.
I may.
Concisely, and remember what I said about the word concise?
So yes, I try. To the first point of like adding all the top 100 websites up, yeah, I wouldn't dispute that number, but basically behind all those top 100 sites, there's a business that needs to earn money, that has cost. You don't buy all the top 100 books or whatever cars or things, don't watch all top 100 movies of a year in cinema because you cannot probably afford that. And the same applies here, right? This is a business, this does cost money, and you have to make choices again, which ones you want to use and which ones you want to see or buy or whatever. So I think I get the point. I think it's not a fair point. On the second one, I mean, GDPR hurt us in other ways a lot already. And I'm not complaining about that. That's why I didn't mention it. But like, we have 3 people full-time working on GDPR stuff, which we didn't have before. So we have like processes set up. We have tools to handle user requests for information, for deletion, whatever. We had to restructure things to do that. So I think we already took like a decrease in well, not revenue, but in this case, in profit, because we just had more cost. Yes, I think still the argument is fair to say, like, if we have to change our business model because of laws, we at least want to aim. That's our, I mean, we have owners who expect profit. That's our duty as executives of that company to actually maintain the profitability. I think that's fair.
Etienne, again,
Was that concise enough?
briefly. Yes, that was...
I would like to say, Max, you've been demonstrating to the entire world that you are talented and smart. When you make this kind of addition, I would like to listen to you, but I don't listen to you anymore, because this is a fictitious multiplication, taking for granted that I would use my forecast service, but I would have to pay for it, even if there is no advertising in it. I would use my Waze or Google Maps service, having to pay for it, even if there is advertising in it. And I would have to do it systematically because I would never consent to advertising. So this is absolutely fictitious.
Sorry, because it became a bit personal, I take the liberty to answer quickly. We went, and you can go through the website that on our website we have the list. These top 100 websites I really pretty much visit right now. And so if my choice is still that, it's de facto paying this amount of money on the other side. And that is also why the economics is really interesting, because it's fundamentally overcharging, because no one makes that money in online business. No one makes these 36,000 euros. And that is the interesting part. If we roll it out further, how are we going to contain that? How are we going to contain that not 36 apps are all going to charge about that price?
I would have an answer to your question.
And you're going to save it for afterwards.
But by considering...
No, because we really are 10 minutes to go, and we need to take at least a few questions from the audience. Hands up, because I know it's, yes. Right. We'll take them in groups of 3, so I'll go 3 here and you as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great panel. I will be as brief as possible. I wanted to say, Tobias, by the way, bravo. I think I want to applaud you for the Norwegian DPAs, like when you guys banned the Meta's behavioral advertising prices. It's like one of the most clearest piece of legal writing that I read, which is not the same in the EDPB's case. I guess it was like a lot of compromises that you need to make. But I think what I like in both is the focus about the large platforms and Meta. I think sometimes when we talk about exploitation from the advertising, we focus about the exploitation of the consumer, but we forget that publishers are also often exploited by the big platforms. And I think the central issue is the infrastructure providers, which are in this case 2 large platforms. And unfortunately, and today I'm very surprised that also publishers don't see beyond that. And like, it's like if you have 3 stores, and yes, I'm going to hurry up, but if you have 3 stores and one of them is avoiding taxes, 2 of them are not going to be able to compete. And what publishers are trying to do is trying to compete and try to say, you know, don't let us pay taxes as well, which is like, leave us alone. And it's unfortunate. The infrastructure has to change. And this is just like a main comment. And I just want also to finally tell publishers, if the infrastructure were to change, which seems likely, don't become Meta and Alphabet, which seems likely with sometimes with some approaches that you take, and allow the fair infrastructure to take place and participate in it rather than try to control it.
Okay, Akim, yes,
Yeah.
I see you. And then
Okay,
Cornelia.
thank you.
Yeah.
Two short points. One thing, I don't believe consent figures as long as there are tons of dark patterns outside where you have to do nothing to consent and click 27 badges to not consent. So then you can say 97% means 95% of those haven't even seen the options. No. Second point, we are not talking about pay or consent on advertising, but on tracking, on collecting 65,000 categories of data on each individual that visits one of your website, which sells data to the RTB industry, which on the other hand takes 50% of the advertising expenditure of the brands. So it's more a remark than a question.
Okay.
So I have a question that concerns a little bit a point that you raised, Etienne, and generally is
Just
it
really
work?
close,
Okay,
yeah.
sorry. So first of all, congratulations to the panel. I would have, and this comes to my question, I would have loved to have someone from a competition aspect here, potentially from the DMA unit. The point you made, Etienne, is that you have to look, the DPAs can only look at data protection, and then the competition authorities only at competition law. But I think when you look at the new laws that we have, they are converging a lot of these issues. In the Netherlands, for example, the ACM has now a collective way of looking at these issues. That hasn't happened yet at the EU level, but I think when it does, you would actually see that some of the solution might be interoperability, which brings more consumer choice that you have obviously in the journalism market. If the site is too expensive, then I go to Die Welt or not, depending on what I like. But I would like to hear a little bit how you, and maybe in particular Norwegian representative, how you think about the interaction with other tools that are existing in other laws that also help this consumer welfare.
Okay, Toby, Max, do you want to respond to a couple of those? We should have a throwing mic, unfortunately, but okay, we'll get these through.
May I also, a short question. I think you should not mix up quality journalism and what's happening on Meta or Google, because the platforms rely on certain non-liability rules because they say it's user-generated content, and that is not something which is produced by Spiegel or by other publishers. This is really, I think, a huge difference, and it should not be mixed up.
Okay.
And Meta says we don't have news on our platform anymore. Google says it's just 2 or 3% of what we provide. And I think it's much more because they need the news to attract people to their platforms.
Okay, I'm going to let the panel make quick responses, and I mean quick to these because I see at least another 6-7 hands, and we've 4 minutes left. So, Toby, do you want to respond quickly to, I think Cornelia's mentioning?
So,
Yeah.
many interesting questions and remarks. I think in terms of interoperability and interplay, we do actually have a lot of contact with both the Competition Authority in Norway, Consumer Authority, and doing so is very, very useful because the consumer authorities will often look at the information and the Competition Authority will say, well, we're not price regulators either. So the question is who regulates what's within the vacuum between these regulators, and this is indeed a bit unclear, but I can say that both on a national level and also on the EDPB level, there is a lot of interaction to try to solve these issues. So it's something that we are mindful of and working together and not in the silos. And also, if I may just explain very quickly, or respond very quickly, indeed there is a big difference between the media here and Google and Facebook. But if you look at, for example, on the Norwegian level at the advertising market, even for publicists, 40% of the revenue still go to Facebook and Google, or Meta and Google, because they own the infrastructure, right? And that doesn't mean that 60% goes to the media. No, there are other third parties, and actually a certain proportion of the revenue, we don't know where it ends up. No one knows where the money ends up. So this is a big issue, and so there's something fundamentally wrong here. And if we're saying, oh, in order to maintain high profits, we need to kind of derogate from the freely given consent thing in order just to make this work, it's really quite strange. We keep perpetuating this system. There's no incentive to actually innovate, to find other viable forms of advertising. And I would say that even for the media, when we speak to the Norwegian media, they say, well, yeah, we rely on advertising, behavioral advertising today, but it's volatile. And actually the income is not stable and it might be decreasing. So it's not a long-term solution anyhow.
Quick question.
Just 10 seconds about freedom of choice and power imbalance. This is something we should untangle, I guess. And having a general discussion on payer consent maybe is not the best way. We should look at, I guess, dependency, structural dependency, individual all goods that create dependency are hyper-regulated. Plus, here is not a normal product because it's fundamental right. So I'm wondering whether we can really compare, but this was already answered, journalism to social media, where there is so much addiction and dependency on a structural individual level.
Can you pass it to the back? I see a gentleman with a red tie at the back.
Can I say 2 sentences?
2 sentences, and then it needs to go to the back because his hand was up first, actually.
Yeah. Maybe to Mr. Keizer from the side. So maintaining a business model is not a legitimate reason or interest to go for pay or okay. If maybe the business model is corrupt or has been corrupt and has been designed corrupt and in violation of the GDPR and other rights, then that's the business model's problem. It's not the problem of, well, whoever's rights are violated.
Okay, right to the back. Yes, project. Yes.
Point about this being not merely about tracking, but actually collecting the cookie data needed to run advertising and get paid at all. Why are we not talking about the fundamental right to conduct business?
I can take that one.
Okay, Max,
me too.
Take that one.
Just to wrap it up, first of all, thanks for giving me the chance to educate everybody in the room about the right to run a business. If you look at the case law of the Court of Justice, and I know the industry is repeating that over and over again, it's just utterly false. The right to conduct a business is the right to open a business without, for example, limitation of having 5 licenses for media in a country, which we did have way back when. It is not the right to make money, which it's in the GDPR discussion very much conflated with. So I don't think that the premises of the question is legally correct, if I may.
Okay, I see there were 3 questions here in the front. I'm going to let you use my microphone if you want to quickly grab it.
Hi, so this is really a question. If the Irish Data Protection Commission ruled that Meta could use its current version of PROK system, it's for Toby, would that go against the EDPB's decision, in your opinion? And if so, would you challenge the Irish decision?
Okay, we're getting into specifics here. Do you want to follow up bilaterally, or do you want to? Okay.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah.
I can tell you we're looking at challenging whatever the decision is, so we'll probably get it into the courts anyways.
Okay, speaking of following up bilaterally, there is a coffee break after this, so you can all try and grab the panelists. Anyone want a final word?
I think there were some questions for you.
I mean,
Marco?
there was something, points addressed
Yeah.
at me, so not a question really, but I never said we want to maintain the business model. I said we want to maintain the profits, right? And we have to change the business model to do that. And that is illegal, this business model of targeted advertising under GDPR is your opinion. There's no ruling on that. It's not been banned, right? So if it's gonna be banned, then we'll deal with it, right? But it's not. We're allowed to do that. Nobody tells us we cannot do that, right? So it's a kind of like pointless discussion at this point in that regard. I respect your opinion, right? But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And just to the last point, I mean, there's no right to make a profit, but there's a duty to make profit if you run a business, at least in Germany. So if you don't make...
Under the corporate law of Germany, but not as a
course,
fundamental
but still,
right.
I mean, it's not a fundamental right, but like,
I agree.
It goes along with national law, right? And so I still think there is a fundamental right of running a business, and running a business without making profits is not really running a business, I would say. But yeah, again, I'm not a lawyer.
Etienne, Max, Sandra, Toby, any final words on the path forward?
It was very interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming as well.
Thank
you.
Thank you.